welcome back. My name's Chris. I teach French at We Communicate, and in this video I'll be talking about the advantages of bilingual classes, which is something I happen to know a thing or two about since it's my specialty. So I'm going to be speaking about the English-speaking minds, the French-speaking minds, and the problems the two can have when they meet in a learning situation. And before we start, this is not something I think, this is rather something I know from having seen it a sufficient amount of times. So if you've been experiencing difficulties learning French, by which I mean more than a year or two to learn the language, this video is for you. Appearing on the screen in front of your very eyes is the brain of a speaker of English. As you can see, it contains a lot of English, and this English has been present in the brain of the speaker of English for many, many years, and has shaped the way they use language, but also the way they think about language. All this includes the prior life experience of the speaker of English who's now approaching French. It's like a highway code that tells the speaker of English what a language should logically do. And the most noticeable trait is, of course, pronunciation. It's your English or American pronunciation, but there are other factors, such as the assumption that we use intonation to shape a message. Saying, for example, "That's amazing." Well, it adds to the message. This intonation, this instinctive intonation, adds to the message and shapes it, but we don't think about it. It's something we do instinctively because we know that another native speaker of English will understand this intonation. It's like asking your partner what's wrong and they say nothing. We don't usually walk off and say, "Oh good, they said nothing's wrong, fantastic news." No, of course not. So we see here that the intonation, the way we say nothing, it shapes the meaning. And it can even contradict the meaning, which is something you understand as a native speaker of English. So there's a whole series of things that we, as native speakers of English, find simply make sense about language in general. And most of these are subconscious. We don't usually reflect on our own use of our first language. It's a bit like stirring tea with a spoon. You don't usually think about your technique when you do it. Using language is the same thing, you just do it. We can compare this life experience to an aquarium. It's like a social aquarium. We've lived all our lives in a certain environment and we pick up habits that include a language. And appearing on the screen is an aquarium. It's the English-speaking aquarium, and you're wet from living in a certain aquarium, but it's not the sort of wet that you can just dry off with a towel. So with all this background in mind, this social aquarium, there you are now approaching French and you want to learn it. And you take your first class or you take your first course, but the way you approach this class will be influenced by your background, by this social aquarium. And remember that you already presuppose a huge number of things about language. It's like gravity. We presuppose the existence of gravity. So you presuppose things too about language without being aware of it. A practical example of this might be the order of the information in a sentence. We don't usually speak like Yoda. We don't usually say difficult is the French language to learn. And that's just because we assume that the subject goes somewhere at the beginning of the sentence, and here it's halfway through. But what if French functioned in the way Yoda speaks? Just for the sake of argument, what if? We could see how there could be a learning problem here. A more realistic example perhaps than the one with Yoda, and that I actually see in my classes, is the assumption that grammar isn't important when learning French, just because learners don't remember ever learning English grammar in school. But the way English works, it's a language we can just repeat. But what if French was a different type of language? But here we are assuming that the two are structurally similar. A second example of a subconscious assumption about language might be the role of sounds. As we know, English is a language we can just pronounce any way we want. There's no rule to say how we're supposed to pronounce English. And you might have noticed how many American actors seem to mumble in series, because the meaning isn't necessarily attached to the quality of the sounds, but more the overall tone of the message, the way they modulate the message. And when I do face-to-face classes, many of my students are surprised at how much of a perfectionist I am when I teach them French pronunciation. That's because the tiniest of sounds can contain crucial information. But we have this in English also, and it's a matter of knowing where the priorities are. A little grunt can be very important. If you say, "I hoovered the lounge," the little I hoovered, it's not even a sound, it's like a grunt, but it tells people that it happened in the past. "I hoovered the lounge." You know subconsciously that this grunt is important if you speak English as a native. A teacher of English might know this consciously because they've reflected on such things, and it's also their job to know these things. But many foreign users of English don't know this because they were never told. So they might say, I hoover lounge, whether it's in the past, the present, or the future. I hoover lounge because they were never told that is quite an important thing in English. This is just one example. So to go back to our English-speaking brain, it's composed of habits and language rules, most of which we don't think about, and it's our highway code for language. At this stage in the presentation, I have a few questions for self-reflection, which I would like to submit to you. In your opinion, would it be useful if you had a language teacher, a French teacher, who knew those rules in your language, by which I mean English? So we're speaking of a teacher who knew exactly how you feel about language for reasons that, one, they're native speakers of English themselves, two, they also teach English, and three, they also teach French. In your opinion, would it be useful? And whatever your answer to the question, keep it in mind, keep it to yourself. I can't hear you anyway, but keep it in mind. It will be useful, it will be important for the rest of the video. Let's now talk about French teachers for a second, and appearing on the screen is the brain of a French teacher from France. And I love France. It should be known that I love France. It's really beautiful. It has lovely countryside, delicious food, strong work unions, short work weeks, lots of holidays, and the slow-paced lifestyle that we all love. So here's the brain of a French teacher, and just as your own brain did, they too have lived in a social aquarium, a certain social aquarium that's full of French ideas about language. And it makes sense that a native teacher of French, a native speaker of French, would be influenced by their own aquarium, by which we mean a certain approach to language and to teaching as well. In a typical French class, by which I mean non-bilingual, we have two people from radically different social aquariums who've lived in radically different conditions and built radically different highway codes about language. And we're talking about subconscious habits. Considering this, I have a few more questions for self-reflection. What fraction of your first language, I mean English, does the average teacher know about? And I don't mean words, I really mean a blend of linguistic and cultural, all the subconscious things that your instinctive highway code tells you about language. And we're talking about decades worth of knowledge. What fraction, what proportion does your language teacher know about all these things? Question number two, how much of their own social aquarium are they aware of? Are they perpetuating habits in spite of themselves that comes out in certain teaching traditions due to that social aquarium? And how fixed in their brain is their own linguistic highway code? And perhaps most surprising of all, question number three, can a native speaker of French be a native speaker of English? Can they be you? I suppose the answer to this last one is yes, but in most cases I think it's usually going to be no. And in most cases we have French teachers who cannot know, who really cannot know what it's like to be a speaker of English. They've never had access to your highway code. You might agree on this, and they might have read a few pages in school or even a few chapters if they went to university, but largely I think it's fair to say that the typical French teacher doesn't know what it's like to be you. They don't know your language highway code. I would say that even if your French teacher is conversant in English, they can speak to you in English, they still don't quite know what it's like to be a speaker of English. I don't think they would ever know. How would they know? Right? I'm not asking a question, I'm actually saying they cannot know. And we're talking about decades of exchanges in English that you've had as a native, the thousands of conversations you've had, and it's almost at DNA level. We're really almost speaking about a DNA, an English-speaking DNA, and they have the French-speaking DNA. It's that complex. As I see it, in the typical monolingual French class, you have two different participants, two different language DNAs, and two different social aquariums. And the two somehow have to come together for learning to take place and for a transfer of information to take place. But not everyone agrees on this. I once had an ESL teacher in my French class, a very nice lady, ESL, English as a second language. She was a qualified teacher of English. to whom I was teaching French, and so she'd found work in France, and she was from Yorkshire, a very nice lady, very thick Yorkshire accent. I think she was actually from York. She found work in France through a school, but she spoke zero French. I remember that's the reason she was taking French classes with me. She spoke zero French. And I asked her if she anticipated that it would ever be a problem, considering she was going to teach French pupils. You know, she only knew English, and I don't remember my question that much, but I do remember her answer, and she answered with full confidence, "No, I can teach English to everyone." And I never forgot the answer. So to recap the way I see a typical French class, we have two brains from different highway codes and two very different social aquariums. One has to get their knowledge through to the other while not knowing where the other is exactly coming from. And I mean the English language. And the other, the recipient of this information, has to receive this knowledge while not being aware of their own highway code, their own English highway code, and not knowing the highway code of the teacher. And all this seems very complex to me. There's a very simple reason I only teach native speakers of English, because I consider that anything else I would be navigating in the dark. I don't teach Italian people because I don't know Italian, and I don't know what they consider to be normal about language. It's not just about the words. I don't know what they consider to be normal when it comes to language. It's not the vocabulary of Italian, it's more than that. It's a lot deeper, it's almost at DNA level. So I don't know how they use language or how they subconsciously think about language. If I were to teach French to a speaker of Italian, I wouldn't know why the mistakes were happening nor how to correct them. I wouldn't be able to say, whereas Italian does this, French or English does that. And I would only be able to do that, to bridge those languages together, if I was an absolute expert in all those languages. And this has actually happened to me in reality. This was years ago. There was a young girl, she was Italian, learning English with me. I was on italki. She was an artist. She even sent me a picture for my birthday. Lovely, very, very talented artist. And I remember the headache it was to attempt to stop her from making all the ah sounds at the end of every word. You know, she would say, for example, I don't know, hello, Chris. You know, she'd always add a little vowel at the end. And she wasn't aware she was doing it, and I had no idea why she was doing it, because I don't know the first thing about Italian phonetics. So I was really stabbing in the dark. I don't know. So I think, what was she called? Lucia? I can't remember. And I remember saying, have you noticed that each time you say a word, in English, you say, hello, yes, you know, she always added that little sound. But we didn't know why it was happening. She wasn't aware of it, and I didn't know. So all I could do was sort of point it out. But if I could have explained, whereas Italian does this, English does that, well, it would have made it all the more simpler, of course, which I couldn't do. And we can push this idea much further, because this is just a basic example. But what if there was a certain Italian past tense that had 3 different functions, whereas the same equivalent tense in French or in English only had 1 function? Subconsciously, what would happen is that the brain of the speaker of Italian would give them the go-ahead to replicate all those 3 functions in their target language. But the teacher, the poor teacher, wouldn't know why they're doing it, because they don't know the 3 functions of that past tense in Italian. Of course, as a teacher, I'd hear that mistake, but I would be a reactive teacher. I wouldn't be able to anticipate. I would be saying, well, I wouldn't understand why they're doing it. All I would be able to say is like the example of the adding a vowel at the end of every word. I would just point it out, and I wouldn't know why it's happening. And I would always be playing catch up instead of anticipating the mistake, simply because I don't know the language of my student. So failing to be an expert in the language of the student, a class would essentially be a one-sided transfer of information from native speaker teacher to native speaker learner who both speak different languages, who are wet from stepping out of different aquariums, and none would really understand the other. And this, I'm sorry to say, is what you'll find in your non-bilingual language class. My name's Chris from We Communicate. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.